Hello and welcome back to week number 10 here in plant biology. This is the second half of our readings, and this will be in chapter 11 of Concepts of Biology. And chapter 11 is all about evolution. Evolution is a foundational concept in theory when we're talking about science. Without understanding the basics of the concepts of evolution, it's really difficult to understand in a broad sense what's going on in biology. So evolution is an important concept, and it's one that we definitely need to talk about in this class. So in this chapter, we're going to be covering how populations change, the mechanisms of evolution, the evidence of evolution, a specific type of evolution called speciation, and some common misconceptions about evolution. So this is an important chapter, and one that's, I'll say, more general science based, but totally germane towards plant biology too. Since plants are organisms, they are constantly evolving in their environments as well. So the chapter starts out discussing a little bit about the history of evolution and the history of scientific thought surrounding evolution. And the most famous scientist associated with evolution is, of course, Charles Darwin. I have a tiny plastic bust of Charles Darwin on my bookshelf in my office. Extremely important in developing a modern sense of what evolution is. The most famous sort of organism that he looked at were a group of birds called finches on the Galapagos Islands as part of his travels on a ship called the Beagle. Fascinating story, led to his work on Origin of Species. A contemporary of Darwin's, his name was Alfred Wallace, also had similar ideas at the same, around the same time. So although Darwin gets most of the credit, Wallace is also important in that conversation as well. So read through that history on Darwin and Wallace and really look at the evidence that they used to build their understanding of evolution based on natural selection. And natural selection is this this driving force which is really setting up the stage for evolution. And natural selection occurs when we have variation in populations and variations in environments that those populations are going to respond to. And that's really what it comes down to, is there variety in the population of a species in a place, and is there some sort of external pressure to force a change that would select for particular traits within that individual population. Now, Darwin's ideas were not, I'll say, fully formed in a modern sense, but it was a very good foundational work to build on, and we really are working on building our understanding of the theory of evolution in a modern way. And the text talks a little bit about what's known as the modern synthesis of evolution. And it really is effective at describing the systems that we see happening in the world today. When we're looking at this modern synthesis of evolution, we can really sum it up. I think the book does a good job and really looks and says natural selection affects population's genetic makeup, and this in turn leads to these gradual changes of these populations and possibly into the development of a new species. There are small changes that can occur, that's called microevolution, or we can have these sort of larger separations, which would be known as macroevolution. Regardless, when we're looking at evolutionary changes, we're really looking at the changes in the genetics of a population. And so populations are the levels at which we're really looking at these evolutionary changes. It's important to understand that individuals do not evolve. You are as evolved as you will ever be. Your genetics are set. They don't change. So evolution does not occur at the individual level, it occurs in populations. And so when we're looking at the genetics of populations, that's why we're interested in these changes over time. So one of the great examples of population genetic changes are these peppered moths that we can see in figure 11.6 of the book. And we can see that given these changing environment of England in the Industrial Revolution, we get this shift in what these moths look like due to soot deposition on trees. So it's a great example when you're reading the book, go through it. Keep that in mind as one of these sort of seminal examples of population change due to environmental pressures. We can also have genetic drift, where we have individuals leaving or leaving populations, or individuals coming in and bringing new genetics. Lots of different ways in which genes move through different populations. When we move on to look at the mechanisms of evolution, there's a few different ways. Natural selection is really this driving force that says if there's an advantage, over time it will accumulate in these populations, in these phenotypes of the organisms within this population. Mutation is a different way we get evolutionary change. Sometimes there's just random changes in the genetic material of organisms, and if that genetic change produces a resultant advantage, those species will then be better fit to their environments and be more reproductively successful. If that mutation produces a deleterious change, or a change that is harmful, those individuals will be weeded out of the population. Evolution is a harsh crucible in which to test one's genetics, and it's really the driving force for change of populations around the world. Genetic drift is another way that alleles in populations change. Again, this is the movement of individuals. Really the movement of these individual alleles in these populations. And so these sort of chance events and movement of genetic material, it happens. And sometimes it can be a dramatic shift just from a random happenstance sort of event. The book goes through discussing why in small populations these genetic drift events are more important than in large ones. And so that's a good way to look at genetic drift. We can also talk about bottleneck events. These are events where populations are dramatically reduced, so you end up with a smaller population and subsequent changes in the allele frequencies in those populations as well. We can also talk about gene flow, where we have the movement of alleles or these traits in and out of different populations. It's just the movement of genetic information between different groups. These events happen all the time. It really is important to understand these driving forces of these evolutionary processes to understand how the theory of evolution is affecting populations today and has in the past. When we're looking at populations in the past, we're really looking at sort of evidence of evolution, and fossils are a great treasure trove of evidence of evolution. There is a rich fossil history around the world for any number of organisms. That's not to say the fossil record is completed. By no means is complete, but if we're looking at the fossil record for organisms, tracking that through the past, there's great evidence to support the ideas and working theory of evolution as a biological process. We can also look at anatomy and embryology as evidence of evolution, and we can look at shared structures, homologous structures, and analogous structures. Figure 11.11 has a great example of these shared traits in animals, but similar ideas holds true in plants as well, that shared ancestry is going to have shared traits. And we can look at different families of plants and see that even within a family as diverse as, say, the Asteraceae family. So we're going to have a huge variety of plants, but we're still going to have some shared traits and that are going to be held in common throughout this family. And that's really sort of these foundational ways in which taxonomy is built. We'll be talking about taxonomy in a little bit, a little further on in the semester, but these ideas of shared traits and shared structures holds true throughout the biological world. We can also look at a concept called biogeography, where we can see that plants or animals are similar in the fossil record, and as they move apart, we can track these changes in coordination with, say, plate tectonics, and we can see how these populations have changed over time as they separate from one another. And this is more solid evidence for evolution, and these biogeographical lines of evidence were really a key player when Charles Darwin was looking at building his ideas of evolution as well. So if you're seeing fossils of clams at the tops of mountains, that says, this place was different in the past. What does that mean for the world around us? And that was challenging for the modern thinking of the day, but it's important when we're looking at evidence for evolution. Modern evidence of evolution really comes down to sort of molecular biology and molecular techniques, and saying, how can we track changes in genes over time using modern techniques and technologies? And that evidence is overwhelming as well. We can have different types of evolution, and we can look at the distribution of species, and so we get these different types of what are called speciation events, and we can have different speciation events occurring for different reasons. A major reason that we can have a speciation event, the splitting of one species into two different species, is through geographic separation. So I mentioned earlier that we can look at tectonic plates moving across the landscape, and we get this physical separation of organisms over time. And that geographic separation has an effect of possibly changing what species looks like over time. We can also have what's called adaptive radiation, where we have species moving to a place and changing in response to the different environment of those places. It's a really interesting way of changing. We can also have speciation without geographic separation. So sometimes there can just be chromosomal shifts that occur as part of the chance sort of processes of life, and we can get these shifts and changes from one species to another even if these species are still in the same place. But these usually come down to reproductive barriers of some sort, whether they be behavioral or chromosomal. But those are the sorts of changes that we can get when there's species within each other. Common misconceptions about evolution are also covered in this chapter and are important to talk about as well. The first one is that evolution is just a theory. In the scientific sense, if something is a theory, it's essentially the same as saying it's a fact. There is so much evidence that promotes this idea through consistent experimentation and different concepts that there is no better explanation. Now, one of the best things about science is that if better evidence comes along, those theories change. Science is not fixed. It's always changing, growing, and adapting. And so just a theory means it's something that people are still working on. And the current understanding is that this is what's happening. But if new evidence arises, that's the way it happens. Individuals evolve is another misconception. Again, I mentioned that earlier. You are not evolving. The population that you live in could be evolving, though. Evolution does not explain the origins of life. That's a very different sort of question. Organisms do not evolve on purpose. Populations evolve because of environmental pressures or because of genetic changes. Also, evolution is not controversial among scientists at all. And that being said, the basic scientific understanding is what is taught, and so that's what we're going to be teaching in this class. So that should wrap up Chapter 11 on evolution, and hope you guys have a great weekend, and I'll talk at you later.